Welcome to In Conversation with David Frum. I'm your host, Sean Speer, editor-at-large at The Hub. I'm grateful to be back in conversation with David for another installment of our bi-weekly video and podcast series on the big issues shaping Canadian policy and politics. In today's conversation, we'll discuss Prime Minister Mark Carney's visit to the Oval Office, what to make of his interactions with President Trump, and what it might all tell us about future negotiations between Canada and the U.S. on a trade and security agreement. As well, if time permits, I'll ask David about President Trump's sudden and unpredictable attack on middle-class consumption and what, if anything, to make of it. David, thanks as always for joining me.
Oh, Sean, it's so good to talk to you.
David, since we last spoke, we've had a Canadian election, of course, and in his first act, virtually as Prime Minister, Mark Carney traveled to D.C., where he met President Trump in the Oval Office. Before we get into some of the specific details, why don't you just reflect on the atmospherics? What did you take away from Prime Minister Carney's first in-person interaction with President Trump?
Well, Prime Minister Carney passed the very first test of finding the right tone, which is to say, not hostile, but not too friendly either. Dignified, patriotic, and unillusioned. I think he hit all of those messages. I think he also flushed out Trump's plan for how to bring this trade mania to something more like a resolution, which is Trump is going to have private definitions of what counts as a trade deal,
Yes.
and is going to announce success because he gets some signature on a piece of paper. During the Obamacare debate, the Saturday Night Live had a sketch about Joe Biden sitting in for Obama when he was on a foreign trip and said, "Look, you send me a stack of blank pages with the word healthcare printed on the first page, and I'll sign it." And I think that's where Trump seems to be heading, is to just get me some face-saving way out of this. But it's not a very workable plan. It may meet his ego needs, but it will not actually get world trade back on track, and it won't help the American economy very much.
I do want to get into the specifics of a possible deal, including the fact that the conversation seems to be heading in a bilateral direction. But before we get there, just at the level of atmospherics, it seems to me that Prime Minister Carney was having to essentially move in two separate directions. The first is to be conciliatory in a way, to try to build a personal rapport with President Trump, but also to be responsive to the Canadian public's mood, which, of course, is not inclined towards conciliation or compromise. How do you think he did on that score?
Well, he's got a new problem post-election. During the election, when he was running against Pierre Poilievre, who was regarded by Canadians as potentially sympathetic to Trump, whether that was a fair regard or not, that's the way it was seen. Carney never had to work, is there space to my anti-Trump side? Can anybody get to the more anti-Trump side of me? He didn't have to worry about that during the election. He does have to worry about that now. Doug Ford has been more anti-Trump than Carney.
Yes.
There are other provincial premiers who have sounded notes that are quite anti-Trump. And if the Conservative Party does rethink its leadership, that Carney may can face charges of, well, you sold out, you gave away too much. And I think a lot of Conservatives will say, because Carney waged that method unfairly against them, they're not disposed to give him a lot of fairness in their turn.
Yes. Yeah, I would just say in parentheses, you saw a lot of that commentary immediately out of yesterday's meeting from Conservatives. Criticisms that Prime Minister Carney had played to the so-called elbows up crowd during the campaign, but yesterday described Prime Minister Trump as a quote-unquote transformational figure. And as you say, I think over the coming weeks, that tension will be something that no doubt will be top of mind for Prime Minister Carney.
By the way, can I just point to that word? That's such a well-chosen word, because is it wrong? Trump's transformed NATO into non-NATO. He's transferred free trade into non-free trade. He's transferred the Biden boom into the Trump depression. Trump hears that word and thinks, of course you mean transform for the better. And it's like that word consequential, the person who drives his car into a brick wall is a consequential driver of that rental car.
Now, David, over the past several months, we've talked a lot about whether it's in Canada's interest to pursue some type of bilateral versus trilateral arrangement. Should we read too much into the fact that both President Trump and Prime Minister Carney have been talking about a quote unquote trade and security agreement between Canada and the United States. Is that a signal in your mind
Yeah.
that we're moving in a bilateral direction? And if so, what are the consequences in your mind?
Well, Canadian governments have historically regarded Mexico as the unfortunate and unwelcome stepchild of the
Yes.
U.S.-Canada relationship. And Canada has a lot of reasons to be annoyed with Mexico right now. Mexico certainly played the trilateral game to its national advantage, which nations do. And it's also done something that I think is quite annoying to Canadian leaders, which is it struck some more anti-American rhetorical notes while actually
Yes.
giving away much more to the United States than Canada has ever done, which
Yes.
Mexico is able to do because they have a controlled press and a not very free political system. So Canadians may think, why should the Mexicans don't care about us? Why should we care about them? But it looks like not Trump himself, but the more economically literate people around him, the way that the fusion of Trumpism with rationality that they're heading toward is what if we create a fortress North America in which the United States writes tariff laws for the whole continent and
Yes.
Mexico and Canada submit to whatever rules the United States wants
Yes.
against China, against India, against the whole rest of the world, and they get access to the American market in exchange for giving up their any kind of sovereignty over tariffs and trade. Um,
Yes.
and that the bilateral relationship has that as its end point. Look, I remember this back during the 80s when we were arguing about the U.S. Canada Free Trade Agreement. The counter that was the smartest counter that was made to people like me who favored the agreement was, you're just signing up for a customs union with the United States where they will always write the rules. And the answer that people like me gave, and it was true in 1988 and true for a long time afterwards, is America's idea of a customs regime is more free trade oriented than the Canadian governments will ever would be. So even if it's
Yes.
true that Canada becomes a customs taker from the United States, that's still a move toward global free trade. We're not sacrificing global free trade for bilateral free trade. But the thing that that smart critique warned about in the 1980s is coming true now, which is too much bilateralism, and you find yourself signing up to protectionism against China and against India and against the rest of the world.
David, there's a lot of policymakers who listen to this podcast every week or every couple of weeks because they've come to depend on your insight and wisdom so much. So let me
And
just
yours
put it
too. Let's
well,
not.
let me just put it to you directly. If you were advising the Canadian Prime Minister and a deal like that was on the table, that is that in exchange for maintaining mostly tariff-free access to the U.S. market, a market that looms large over Canada's economy, that we would have to accept, in effect, adopting the UF tariff regime vis-a-vis China and possibly
Yeah.
other countries. Is that a deal that you would recommend Canada does?
I don't think it's a one way or the other question. I would say if you must, then you must. But my strongest recommendation is everybody take the summer off, starting as soon as possible.
Yes.
If you must take that deal, take it in 2026. Don't take it in 2025, because to get to the point, the flop set sweat, you can see it beginning to bead on Donald Trump's forehead. Um,
Yes.
that the plan's not working. He's going to have to make a lot of concessions. And the right approach, the thing I would recommend for a Canadian government is enter into negotiations and just tell everybody, if I catch anyone here working more than 4 hours a day, you're out. Um, Wine with lunch, people. Wine with lunch.
uh, if we can stay on the subject of the deal or the a possible agreement for a bit longer, it has been a unspoken principle of Canadian trade policy for some time, David, that we ought to separate trade negotiations from a broader array
Yeah.
of issues, including defense and security. Prime Minister Carney has used the language of a trade and security agreement, effectively reversing that
Yeah.
longstanding assumption of Canadian trade policy. And yet there hasn't been really much discussion in Canada about the trade-offs or the consequences of essentially linking trade with defense and
Yeah.
security. What do you think about that, and what do you think the consequences may be?
I think that's a really shrewd move and a timely move. So the reason historically Canada did not want to do it was that Canada depended on the United States for its national defense against a common threat.
Hmm.
The United States did subsidize Canadian defense. Trump is right to make that complaint. And Canadians said we don't that we don't want to put at risk our security in our trade negotiations.
Yes.
Um, that presumption is no longer true. The United States is not offering security to Canada against a common threat. It is demanding security from Canada against America-specific threats that it has largely generated. Canada has no interest in being party to an attack on Denmark to grab Greenland. And look, the destruction of the Russian armed forces in Ukraine means that there's no conventional Russian military threat to Canada. And the threats that do come from Russia, which are infiltration and espionage, Canada is more than capable of cyber warfare. Canada can handle those on its own. And a lot of the Trump adventurism is very anathema to Canada. Canada does not want to be drawn into a guerrilla anti-cartel war in Mexico. Canada does not want to get involved in any of other Trump's stupid, crazy adventures. So Trump's asking on the security that Canada is granting concessions, use of Canadian airspace, use of Canadian territory, and exactly the thing that Canada was afraid of doing back in the 80s and 90s. From a national security, national interest point of view, Canada's well to say, you know what? NORAD is not for free anymore. You have to pay for NORAD.
Yeah. 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 Just in parentheses, one can see a world possibly, David, where we make some, frankly, much needed steps in the direction of defense and security and are able to put those on the table in a trade negotiation that may enable us to get better trade access than we would have otherwise gotten for things we frankly should have been doing a long time ago anyway.
Trump's idea is that the United States is going to retreat from the world into a fortress North America, to which he wants to annex Greenland. And the Greenland piece, I think it sounds so dumb and so stupid and so brutal. And did I say stupid? Let me say stupid again. But understand that what Donald Trump he is not taking military threats off the table against a NATO ally. And he's threatening military action against them. Canada, that would be a violation of Canada's treaty to take any part of that. And an American operation in Greenland might well involve use of Canadian airspace and waters. So why would you want to be party to that? And Trump is also converting what ought to be peaceful competition with China, peaceful competition aimed at helping to steer the Chinese nation into a more positive future. And he is accelerating that into a true great power competition that may not be peaceful, cannot stay peaceful, because he's playing the game too hard against the Chinese. He's threatening their national existence. There's this strange thing about Trump is that because Trump thinks that words are meaningless, he threatens people, and in his mind, he never intends to make good. It's like all the checks he wrote that there wasn't money in the bank to cover. But most people, when they write a check, have the means to cover the check. And the Chinese have to assume that the United States, when it writes a check, has the means to cover a check, and that Trump's words of threat mean something. Does Canada want to be dragged into that?
As we wrap up this part of the conversation, I don't want to move from the substantive, the contours of a final deal, to the superficial, the nature of the personal relationship of the two. But in Trump's world, these things matter, of course. Yeah. What did you make of the rapport between the two yesterday? And if you were advising Prime Minister Carney and his team, how should they think about the bilateral relationship between the two principals?
Yeah. The rapport always means something. In the Trump case, it means more. Look, I think there's a special kind of rapport that Carney has, because the thing that in the world that Trump is most frightened of is the bond market. And that is something that Carney understands and Trump does not. So one of the questions, this is not my original observation, I heard this from a much more expert person, but it's left me thinking, is that the Chinese central bank holds 55% of its foreign currency holdings in US dollars.
Yes.
And those are there both to prevent the Chinese currency from appreciating more than the Chinese want, but also to facilitate trade with the United States.
Yes.
If Trump says there's going to be no more trade between China and by the way, no more movies going back and forth either. We're having total protectionism. It's actually not a trade war against China. It's actually a trade embargo, which is an act of real war, not just trade war. We're doing a trade embargo on China for as long as my presidency lasts. One of the questions that the Chinese central bank would have is, what do we need all these dollars for? What do we need them for? We can't trade with the Americans. Why do we need their currency? Sell. These are useless, but they're not valueless. Sell them.
Yes.
That is something that Carney would be able to articulate in a way that Trump would find very compelling, much more than most of the people. And one of the tools, and one of the ways that Trump is destroying America's role in the world is because he's waged trade war against everybody. He has made, in the trade domain, he has made all of America's former allies and partners effectively temporary trade allies of the Chinese state. Because
Yes.
from the point of view, UK, Japan, EU, Canada, there's less to fear from Chinese trade actions, not China in general, but from Chinese trade action. There's less to fear than from the United States. So you're not going to coordinate your military policy with the Chinese, but your central bank policy, maybe on the same day, Japan, China, Canada, Britain, you dump U.S. bonds altogether in a coordinated action. That might be a kind of, those are the kind of, it's like when, what we're watching here is like the War of the Roses, when you have a stable, peaceful, prosperous marriage that has gone on for years. The two partners know better than anybody else in the world how to make each other happy, but they also know better than anybody else in the world how to make each other miserable. And when one partner decides, my goal here is to make the other one miserable, the other one says, well, I wish we weren't doing this, but I know how to reciprocate.
Final question before we move on to Trump's attack on girl dolls. What's your sense of Prime Minister Carney's overall performance in his first full week after the election? Not only did we have this major bilateral meeting in the Oval Office, you may have seen, David, we had a pretty impressive media avail or press conference
Yeah,
late last week. He clearly, in substance and in style, is implicitly contrasting himself with
yeah,
former Prime Minister Trudeau. What do you think that tells us about a prospective
yeah.
Carney government?
Well, we had this dramatic swing from Harper to Trudeau to Carney, bookended two highly knowledgeable, highly cerebral, highly emotionally disciplined people, very goal oriented, and then Trudeau in the middle, who was very different. So I think a lot of people who remember the Harper style will recognize the Harper style in Carney. He just that. And I don't even know how hard Harper's had to study for the brief because he'd been studying his whole life. So when he got the
Yes.
brief, he could study it. You would know better than me how hard he had to study for any individual event. You got the feeling the same way. Carney doesn't need to put in 2 hours before the presser because he knows it already. He just needs to refresh his memory on a couple of the statistical matters.
Yeah.
But look, his big problem is going to be there are two major files, U.S., Canada, federal, provincial, and they move in discordant ways. And the things that make the U.S. Canada file manageable make the federal provincial file more difficult, and that may turn out to be his point of vulnerability.
Yeah. Well said. Talking about points of vulnerability, one thing that has struck me over the past week or so, starting with President Trump himself and now articulated by other members of the administration, is in a world of American tariffs across the world, they are talking about the need for middle class Americans to essentially
Yeah,
sacrifice their expectations around consumption. I don't want to sound, this will sound a bit peculiar to some of our American listeners, particularly those who have strong aversion to President Trump. But this strikes me, David, as like one of his biggest political missteps to this point,
yeah,
precisely because his superpower has always been that he instinctively understands the place of middle class
yeah,
materialism in American popular culture. What do you make of his anti-consumerist defense
yeah.
of the tariffs, and what do you think the consequences may be?
I've been thinking about this a lot, and it's not a small detail. So, um, key to Trump's success is that he's just a flamboyant and shameless liar. Um, and key to Trump's success is he's been able, whenever the lies are exposed, they're about things that not enough voters care about, or else he's got some excuse. But in this case, he promised his tariff war would be cheap, easy,
Yes.
and would yield immediate economic benefit. In fact, just 2 days ago, the Secretary of the Treasury Besant was in the Wall Street Journal saying by the second half of 2025, you will see more jobs, stronger manufacturing. They've made a series of very specific promises. And those are obviously, if they persist in the tariff policy, those are obviously the exact opposite and the extreme opposite of what's likely to happen. And you can see that they've begun to notice look, life is going to get harder and more expensive for lots and lots of people. Tariffs are also, if they do collect revenue, a tax on the middle class and working class, while at the same time as Trump is planning this massive tax cut for the very richest people in society, a tax cut, by the way, that will balloon the deficit and therefore attract more imports because of the nature of the relationship between the fiscal and the trade deficit. So people are about to see that their lives are about to get hard. So what is Trump up to? He's sending a message that if you complain about the tariffs, you're girly. Because
Hmm.
why did they choose dolls and pencils? Let me give you an example that I was thinking about today. Um, American outboard motors are assembled in the United States, but they're made out of Chinese components. American outboard motors are about to get a lot more expensive if that has not already begun already. Did Donald Trump, would he ever say, why do Americans need their own personal boat? That's kind of self-indulgent. I understand why, Soros and I and, my fellow Bill, why, and Bezos, why we need our big yachts. But you, the, ordinary yokel, what do you need a boat for? You should be proud to sacrifice your outboard motor to the cause of American trade self-sufficiency. Well, wait a moment. I need my boat. So he's prophylactically saying this is not about boats. It's not about things that
Hmm.
Trump voters are going to use. It's about things that are effeminate. It's about
Hmm.
fripperies. If you, how would you compare our great and glorious people's steel mills to dolls and colored pencils? That's not, no real man would ever worry about any of those things.
Hmm. That's interesting, David. I must admit I hadn't thought about the gender dynamics about the choice of products that they've used over the past few days, but it does strike me in keeping with something that we've talked about in the past, and that is an argument that J.D. Vance made on the campaign
Yeah,
trail that in effect Americans should be prepared to trade off
right.
higher prices for toasters in
Yeah,
exchange for protecting American jobs. Up until now, that's not been an argument that Donald Trump himself had made. As you
yeah,
say, his argument was that there were no trade-offs
yeah.
associated with the choices his administration is making. How do you think Americans are going to respond to, in effect, a policy argument saying that yes, of course, the regime of the past several years involving globalization and free trade and all the rest has to be given up in the name of protecting U.S. employment, even if it comes at the expense of less choice and higher prices
Yeah.
for middle class consumers.
Um, if the tariff policy is persisted in, and remember, they are looking for the exits, they are looking for face-saving deals that allow them to proclaim victory and go home. What Americans are about to discover is um, it is not this trade war is not just about finished products. It's not just about the thing that with the made in China stamp. Every manufactured product in the world is including and especially the most high-tech products is at the end of a supply chain that only the mind of God can understand. So
Yes.
my prediction is if Trump, the JD Vances say we have to sacrifice consumer welfare to preserve our manufacturing. My
Yes, sir.
prediction is that they are destroying manufacturing. That at the
Hmm.
end of the Trump period, if Trump persists, there will be less manufacturing in the United States and maybe a lot less at the end of this process than at the beginning because the people who are making because what America has done is gone up the value chain, made highly advanced, but the rotors and the screws and the basic materials are made in China because that's where the least value is. Um, I wrote an article for The Atlantic about the tiny screws that go into the iPhones.
Yes.
So the tiny screws that go into an iPhone, and there are only two that hold the phone together at the base, are indeed made in China, and they're very cheap items, and they're worth. I think if they're coated in nickel, which is the more expensive version, they're worth less than a dime a piece, and if they're coated in anything else, they're worth pennies or fractions of pennies. But the machines that make those screws are made in America, and they are very sophisticated machines. But the machines are also made of steel and include all kinds of components that come from other places. So it is much more likely that not only when you say we're going to try, the effect of saying we want to pull the tiny screw industry into the United States is you actually push the screw making machine industry out of the United States.
Yeah.
Um, so this is not about fripperies. It's not about pencils. It is about American manufacturing power. America is the second largest manufacturing country in the world after China, but it's up at the value chain, and it depends on inputs that are down the value chain. And Trump is waging war on all of manufacturing, not just the dolls, the pencils, and by the way, the outboard motors.
Yeah, tremendous insight. Do you want to take up my observation, David, that this line of argument from Trump in defense of his tariffs seems in tension with what otherwise has been part of his, I think, political success? That is, that he's had a unique insight into the interests and preferences of middle class consumers. I think, for instance, during their campaign, his stop at McDonald's, whatever
Yeah.
one thought of it, but it seemed to demonstrate that he had a kind of intuition about middle class materialism, and one can't help but think that he is now, in effect, arguing against middle class consumption.
I'm absorbing that, and that's a very good point. This, I think you're right. Another way that I would think about it is Trump's intuition was he always understood that his base cares about words, and his marginal vote cares about actions. So because he uniquely among political leaders sees no relationship between words and actions, that he was
Yeah.
free to say all kinds of inflammatory things to excite the MAGA base, but because he didn't follow up on them, or because he talked his way out of them, he could appease the marginal voters. With tariffs, that's what he and his core group are trying to do there. They're trying to talk their way out of consumer shortages. But
Yes, exactly.
but you know what? There's some things you can't talk your way out of. And I think what they're about to discover is he can say whatever he wants. If in fact come Halloween, there are no Halloween costumes in the stores. If come Christmas, you can't buy Christmas ornaments. If Ford and GM begin laying off people because they can't get components. If the American economy goes into recession, he can yap his gums as much as he wants. The thing that elected him was the fact that a lot of people don't pay that much attention to politics. And you know
Yeah.
what? Those people who don't pay that much, they're not going to hear the excuses either. They're just going to notice there are no Christmas ornaments in the stores.
Yeah, those would be regrettable outcomes for those affected, of course. But for those of us who've argued that the administration and people around it have overstated the case against free trade and globalization in a way, it would be a powerful demonstration of its benefits. As we wrap up, why don't we just connect the dots between our two subjects today, the impending negotiation between Canada and the U.S. and the growing defensiveness from the Trump administration on the case for tariffs. How should that, David, inform the Canadian government's plans over the coming weeks and possibly months?
Well, let me answer that in a slightly different way. You and I are recording this at the 80th anniversary of the end of the Second World War in Europe. And there's a lot of triumphalism about that ending. But I want to direct people's attention to not what ended this week in 1945, but what started this week in 1945. The work of reconstruction and reconciliation after 1945, in which Canadians played a very disproportionate role. The goal for Canada is to get that world back. The world, not just a easy bilateral access to the U.S. market, but a world that trades in peace and security and in ever-growing ways that brought in Central Europe and the Pacific Rim, and now where everything turns on whether India and China join that world to the utmost extent. Collective security, the spread of democracy, those things that when the weapons were laid down in Europe in May of 1945 and then in Asia in August, that was the beginning. Now we seem to be at the crisis point of that story and possibly at the end of the story. But that's what was started all those decades ago, and now that's the work that has to resume again in the decades ahead.
What a brilliant way to wrap up our conversation. But before I thank you and turn to the next time we speak, David, let me just say on behalf of our listeners and viewers how much we've benefited from your insight over the course of a rather tumultuous period in Canadian politics. And of course, the first 100 days of the Trump administration, you were kind enough to join us on a weekly basis for the past several weeks. I'm pleased to report that In Conversation with David Frum is going to continue indefinitely. But we are going to revert back to our twice monthly exchanges. I can't wait to speak with you, no doubt. A lot will happen in the next couple of weeks. But thank you for sharing your insight with us over what has been a pretty extraordinary period in the world of Canadian policy and politics. And thanks for continuing to share your insights and wisdom with us moving forward.
And thank you for welcoming me onto this platform you have built and expanded into, I think at this point, maybe the most important platform for the exchange of information and ideas in all of Canada. So it's a tremendous achievement. It's yours, it's Rudyard's, and I'm honored to be a part of it.
Thanks, David. And I look forward to talking to you soon.
Bye-bye.